welcome to the UC Master Gardeners of El Dorado class. What's bugging you? Good, bad bugs versus bad bugs. The UC Master Gardeners mission is to provide research-based knowledge and information on home horticulture, pest management, and sustainable gardening to the residents of California. Today's class is taught by Master Gardener Kit Veerkamp. Kit is a retired landscape architect. She's been a Master Gardener since 2010 and is currently the horticultural chair of the local California Native Plant Society. Let's see, just a little housekeeping. We'll hold questions until the end, so please add your questions in the chat and we'll make sure to answer those at the end of the class. And with that, I'll turn it over to Kit.
Good morning. I'm really glad to have you all here, and you will notice that the title on the screen does not match the title that you were given, and that's because I came up with a better one, what I feel is a better one. Many others have felt that way too, talking about because our insects can be usually our garden allies. So we're going to talk about it in that framework, and gardening to support pollinators and beneficial insects in particular. So here we go. And just so you know, as a source of inspiration for this information, these are really 3 great books. I would urge you to check out or purchase or whatever, but reading these books, Doug Tallamy is very well known these days. And the Garden Allies book is a new book, and particularly it's written by an author from California. So these are great resources for more in-depth information on this topic. So as an overview, we'll be talking about the nature of nature, because our garden allies are very much a part of nature. The insect apocalypse, if you are not familiar with that concept, we'll be talking about a new paradigm in approaching gardening and how you do that in an eco-friendly way. So many of us garden for a number of reasons and use our gardens for recreation. We use them to grow food for ourselves, our families, and friends. We oftentimes use them as an extension to enjoy nature in our own yards, our own backyards, and for just the solace that those gardens provide us. But I also know that, you know, a lot of people get really freaked out by some of the things that show up in their backyard and not quite sure what to do with them. We share our gardens with all kinds of critters. And this is a list of what I personally experience in my yard. My yard is just a small portion of the 5 acres I live on, but I have all of these. The deer are outside my yard, outside in the fence, but everything else pretty much can be in the yard at any particular time, with the exception of rabbits. Fortunately, they can't climb fences. Here's some photographs of the critters I have personally found in my yard. That's me holding some of them. It's a wide array, and I love finding them. I know some people are very freaked out about snakes, but some of these are actually very beneficial. They help keep in check some of the pest insects, snails and slugs in that can be problematic. We've got western toads, the tree frogs, praying mantises, skinks, different kinds of lizards, various kinds of dragonflies. So it's a lot of fun. I really enjoy that. But whether you look at these critters and determine, or think of them as friend or foe, really depends on your perspective. We are conditioned to view most as pests, and the pesticide industry in particular would love us to keep exterminating everything around us, and use their products. Today, over 1 billion pounds of pesticides are applied annually in the US. And even though there's been a decline, what's happened is the newer pesticides, even though they're less toxic to animals, they're more toxic to invertebrates, which include insects. And we'll be talking about why that's significant. And they really aren't good about targeting the specific organism that perhaps you are going after. And pesticide use in California, unfortunately, still remains near record high. What people really need to understand is that less than 1% of insects are actually harmful to plants. And I think that as gardeners, that's what a lot of us are concerned about. You see aphids on our plants or other sucking insects. And when things are out of balance, that can be an issue. 90% of herbivorous, it's a hard one, herbivorous insects co-evolved to specialize on specific native plants. And those native plants have actually developed defense mechanisms to kick in to limit the amount of damage that those insects can do. So they'll emit a hormone or a chemical, and they'll actually notify through the mycorrhizae in the soil the other plants around them of this invasion. And so they all start emitting this. And so you never see, when you look out in nature, you never see that much damage done to native plants. Whereas non-native insect pests, those have been brought in, which we have a number of in California and around the world and this state, they can cause more damage. And this is really where the trouble starts, because they aren't native. There's not as much control on them. We need to convince, or I'd like to convince you, that the world is better with option B over option A. And a lot of this we'll talk about why. And it has to do with a food web person. So I'm one of those lucky people who lives in a very rural area, and so my internet can be unpredictable and uneven. So when I see that my signal is weak, I will stop and pause, and I'll try to back up just a little bit so you don't miss something. But anyway, so taking a food web perspective with respect to insects, insects are really key partners in this whole web of life, that because they do support other life. There's basically 4 categories of insects, and these often overlap. There's the decomposers that help start breaking down plant matter as it falls off of trees, whatever, decays, dies, and helping return it to the soil. We've got our predators, which are also referred to as natural enemies, and our pollinators. And those 3 categories of insects are considered beneficial insects. And then we have our pests, which are generally the chewing or sucking insects. However, some of these insects, for instance, the monarch butterfly, at the caterpillar stage, you might consider it a pest because it's eating the milkweed. Most of us know now that's what we want, although some people still think they've got to apply BT to the milkweed because they see the chewing going on, not understanding that that is the natural phase of that organism, what you want it to be doing in order to morph into the butterfly stage. So these herbivorous insects actually help attract and support the natural enemies that keep them in control. And this is just a small list of those, and we'll go into more detail. So you asked me, why should we care about insects at all? And it's because they are the biological foundation for almost all terrestrial life. And they cycle the nutrients, they pollinate the majority of plants. Oftentimes, many of them just help disperse seeds. They very much controlled populations of other organisms and acting as natural enemies. And they are the major food source for most birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. That's a huge category of other organisms that are supported by insects. This concept of the insect apocalypse was brought up in 2017 in an article that was published in The Atlantic by Dr. Art Shapiro from UC Davis. And he's noted that pesticides, loss of habitat, disease and climate change, and human encroachment are all the major reasons why we're seeing these huge declines. Not only, this was originally found in Germany, discovered in Germany and measured, but this is also occurring worldwide, particularly in more temperate climates. But here in the United States, it's significant as well. In California, we're losing up to 40% of our insects per decade. And it continues that it's a human-caused phenomenon. So these declines are also resulting in declines in other organisms, particularly bird populations. Those are in huge decline. Now this year, we were fortunate to actually get a bump up in the Western monarch butterfly populations, and they're still kind of in awe in terms of, they don't know if it's due to more people planting milkweeds or quite what it is, but we're glad to see it. The impact on birds, as I mentioned, is significant. Without those insects, without the caterpillars, and it's mostly caterpillars that they're feeding chicks, even seed-eating birds feed their chicks caterpillars in the nest, because those are the highest source of protein and fats that help those baby birds mature. So anyway, without the food source, we're getting a lot less birds making it to adulthood. And this 96% due this decline also due to diminished habitat. Okay, there's that, sorry. So waiting again. So anyway, the loss of birds is significant. So we've already mentioned that insects help decompose plant material, and that the plants and insects themselves actually sequester an enormous amount of carbon with their bodies. So that's another aspect of them. A lot of carbon involved there. But nearly all insects are harmless and actually beneficial, and we really need to learn to live with them and have a different outlook about what they do, their role. I don't know if you remember this, but I certainly do. I remember all our family trips up and down Highway 395 or Highway 5 going up and back and forth to Reno where there was family. And I would have to, when I got to be a young adult and I was doing this drive, I would have to stop more frequently to wash my windshield than to get gas. That doesn't happen anymore. And I don't know if, I could imagine that most of you have experienced this as well, but maybe not really notice the difference. I really didn't think about it until it was brought up by Doug Tallamy. And it's like, oh my gosh, yeah, I really do notice that. So habitat loss is also another has a significant impact in terms of one of the reasons that we're seeing these declines in both insects and birds. This habitat loss is due to urbanization and also occurs due to our humongous fires that we're experiencing. Insect infestations of non-native insects are the invasive species plants, because those invasive species are displacing native plants. and also due to pollution. And when you think about it, in our area, only 25% of the natural habitat remains intact in our area. In much of California, far less than that still exists. I'm not sure, other than the Sierra, that exists. I know that the Sacramento Valley, the Great Basin, the coastal regions have all been almost all modified. So this natural state of being in California prior to European settlement, we still do have all of these microbiomes, grasslands, oak savannas, etc. But there's a lot less of them, and especially in their natural state of being. A lot of them are, the grasses have been supplanted by annual grasses, and those environments do not support the same level of biodiversity because of that. So in reality, our actions don't impact just ourselves, just our yards. They really do impact the entire ecosystem. But this is reversible. And we can go beyond this in terms of changing the way we do things and learn to coexist with nature. And really giving up is not an option. We've got a lot of public preserves, public parks, natural areas that are being put into conservation, but those aren't significant enough to support a good population, a good biodiversity. So abandoning this age-old notion that nature is somewhere else that you can go visit. And we really need to embrace a new conservation model that brings that nature home with us. And this is because little habitat remains undisturbed. What we do have is very fragmented, and that fragmentation really impacts populations and especially their vulnerability and ability to spring back from impacts of fire or whatever disturbance may take place. So our parks are not large enough to do the job alone, and this is where we come into embracing perhaps a new model. This old model, pretty much, people have thought, it's been an attitude that people and biodiversity can't exist. That's why we change everything as we develop. A lot of people have the attitude, well, conservationists are taking care of that. But each one of us really does carry a responsibility for stewardship. And we can do that in our own yards by providing viable habitat, and which creates ecological integrity that will support more biodiversity and this population of insects that we're going to be talking about that can help us deal with the other insects we don't want. But we need to stop the steady decline of these insect species. So in the overall concept, we've got our natural areas, and then we have crossings in which wildlife can move back and forth. We've got landscape corridors that generally, if they are done with native plants, they can be connective habitat. If not, they don't provide that service. And then the stepping stones, which are patches, and those patches essentially can be our yards or farms and ranches and municipal parks. Any piece of property that incorporates native plants can become those new patches that support the additional organisms. So there are several things that point us towards this new approach. again, I mentioned that parks and preserves really aren't large enough and they're not substantial enough to support those populations. And by ignoring the ecological value of that land, other land, we don't take advantage of what we can do to support them. Biological corridors can help enlarge those plants and animals, and there's a lot of work afoot, both statewide through the national programs to provide wildlife corridors that helps expand on those, but it's helping by restoring habitat in patches or gardens. We can also work to help expand this so that it's not just government or agencies or organizations doing this work. We can all be involved on an individual basis in this as well. And I like to refer to this as homegrown habitat. And by working with our own gardens, we can provide connectivity, we can provide the habitat area, and we can also interact on a personal level with it and enjoy it, like the pictures I showed earlier, and enjoy it all year long. This was my yard prior to, this is in the works. This is still, that was just a very weedy area behind where I built the pond. And that's the terraces are where my edible gardens are, my fruit trees. But the pond and all the plants around it are all native, as well as all to the right. There's a huge area out that way that is all native, besides everything around me from the rest of the 5 acres. And planted, and this was just last spring, the first year in the ground, you can see the edible garden expanding. And besides strawberry patches under that on the very first tier under the fruit trees, the rest of it has native wildflowers, sedges, grasses, etc. under the fruit trees to help bring in and support native insects, which really do help manage the pests that do show up. Actually, I'm going to go back to that. So let's see, go back. No, it's not. Well, let me go back. Anyway, off to the other side of the greenhouse chicken coop was where I do my raised beds. And I found that the first year when I did straw bale gardens, I was amazed at how few pests I had, a few aphids. I had 8 tomato plants. Don't ask me why. I never ate all those. But the only tomato hornworm I ever found in the garden was actually over on my goji berries somewhere else, and just one little guy. I think that they all got predated on by the native insects, the natural predators, and never did have anything show up that was an issue. And that's a lot to do with the fact that I have quite a population of native plants. So if you don't have 5 acres, if you don't have a large parcel, where can you find the space to do this? Well, one of the logical places you can look is, do you have a lawn? And consider converting that. Turf grasses are a monolithic crop and that really don't support wildlife. They are considered to be ecological deserts. So you might want to, not only that, they really do, in terms of the maintenance time and money that's required to maintain a lawn, for mowing, watering, fertilizing, and pesticide use, if you do that. And like I said, just the time alone. So there's a lot of reasons not to have a lawn. And these are more. They're far less effective in terms of filtering water and sequestering carbon. Less moisture is transpired by plants. So lawn is one of the highest water use. It's what we base our whole water schedules on, which is kind of crazy, but that's how powerful the turf industry is. is that in determining watering schedules, all water usage is based on the amount of water required to keep a healthy lawn, a well-watered, healthy lawn. And that's something that hopefully will continue to change as we go down the road and are challenged by our droughts. Lawns don't provide food or shelter for water life, and they are a carbon sink, not a carbon source. As much as the turf industry would like to convince you that lawns are carbon sources, they aren't, because of all what's required to maintain them. And then we've got introduced plants versus our natives. And green, just because a plant is green does not mean it supports our wildlife in this place. It does where it is native to, but not here where it's been introduced. And plants are what actually determine this carrying capacity for wildlife and insects in particular. The introduced plants don't support the native animals, and they actually, because they don't, they're what are helping add to the decimation of our the species diversity. It's our native plants that perform these ecological roles and provide microbiomes for other native organisms. You can see, I really don't want to spend a lot of time talking about lawns, but the water use is substantially higher than plant material, period, other plant materials. And it's not sustainable. And then the thing is that a lot of people want the perfect lawn, and that's why they use 10 times more chemical pesticides per acre than farmland to try to achieve that goal. And then all the other aspects in terms of fertilizer and pesticide use. The fertilizers not only run off in the groundwater, because there's no way that all of that is absorbed by the roots of the turf, and then affects the health of your soil as well. So a lot of this stuff ends up in the groundwater. And there has been a link shown between lawn pesticides and cancer. And this is where typically people think that they want lawns for their pets and children. And yet it's like, if you are using these chemicals, you really need to rethink that for their health, for your health, if you're out in it. So the solution's pretty simple with respect to lawn. Don't make it any bigger than you need if you need it at all. Just enough for kids and dogs to play, but do not be using fertilizers, pesticides, herbicides. And one of the things that I just learned at a conference, Eco Landscape Conference 2 days ago, is they did this great study on the differences in beneficial insects if you mowed once a week versus twice a week, or every 2 weeks versus every 3 weeks. And they found that if you let the lawn grow a little bit, if there's flowers allowed to be in it, at least it can support some insects, some pollinators. Really, there's quite a diversity beside, this image on the upper right, that's a pretty useless and ecological desert there. Whereas taking a different approach with meadows or even mown native grasses, those will support some biodiversity there. So 90% of the herbivorous insects are actually what we call specialists, and they are evolved to only, sorry for the hiccup, evolved to eat one specific species perhaps, or a genus. They only work within one genus. But that plant has also evolved the mechanisms to keep it at bay in terms of minimizing the damage that's done by them. So this has taken a very, very long time to occur. And again, monarch butterflies are a really great example of that relationship and that evolutionary relationship. This homogeneous palette of introduced plants that we have pretty ubiquitous through California, actually through the whole United States, has really contributed to this decline in insects. And I think you can see, because of these special relationships that have evolved, as those plants are removed, you're also removing the populations of the insects and affecting all the other populations of a lot of other organisms. So most of us learned at some point in school, if we were paying attention, about photosynthesis. Plants transform sun energy into carbohydrates in the plants. The plants store those carbohydrates either in the plant, their leaves and stems, down in the soil, in the roots. It's actually stored in the tissue of the plant materials themselves. And the insects actually convert those sugars and carbohydrates into proteins and fats that then, through breakdown or through this food chain, as other organisms eat those insects, that's their food sources for the vital like vitamins and minerals and all the other things that we need to be sustained. And the thing is that a lot of most insects, well, we talked about that, they're specialists. So anyway, you should be kind of thinking about this, the fact that this whole cycle exists that supports the animals around us. So the consequences in the reduction of native plants has resulted in a reduction in caterpillar biomass, which is what has primarily affected bird populations. And then plus our native pollinators. Most of us are aware that pollinators are really at risk right now. Our pollinators, including butterflies, bees, etc. And these native insects pollinate roughly 90% of all plants and 90% of flowering plants. There's a difference. Not all plants have the same types of flowers, but so just know that our native pollinators are very important to the ecosystem. Introduced plants don't do the same job. A lot of people look around, those plants, my Photinia flower, and I see bees all over them. Yeah, you see honeybees, which are a livestock, not our native bees as much. They just don't support the specialized pollinators that require specific plants. They don't support that complex food web that I just talked about, or a stable food web, because they're more prone to disease and pest annihilation. Therefore, they don't support local biodiversity. So introduced plants, if I can get anything across to you today, are not the ecological equivalents of the native plants that they have replaced in the environment. And a lot of people ask the question, well, what is a native plant? They see that some plants adapt and grow well. That doesn't make a difference. Native plants have actually co-evolved over millennium with the fungi, microorganisms in the soil, and the animals to form this very complex network. And it's very interdependent. And the more complex it is, the more resistant it is to disturbances. And these networks with native plants support more native animals. So when we address pests, oftentimes our first go-to are toxic chemicals. But these toxic chemicals, our pesticides, have usually many more unintended consequences. They can affect human health, our pet health, They kill, the trouble is they're not specific, and they kill beneficial insects right along with the pests. One of the really unfortunate unintended consequences is that pests become more resistant. And then the breakouts get even worse. And those toxic chemicals are also directly detrimental to birds and fish and all the other organisms that are dependent on insects. I really like this quote from Doug Tallamy, or he notes in one of his books that our ecosystems are likened to a well-oiled machine that operates best when all their parts which perform different functions. Something about that, didn't we? Best of all, when all their parts, yeah. So introduced plants are like throwing a monkey wrench into the system. They're a part that doesn't belong here. So thinking of it that way, kind of, it's like, okay, I can get that. Our native good bugs include many of these organisms, which I'm sure you recognize. And oftentimes the reaction can be, ew, I don't want that. I don't like spiders. I don't like, sometimes people are really grossed out about worms, or if they could see the nematodes, sometimes you can see some of the nematodes in the soil. They're very small thread-like organisms, something like worms, but they're not worms. And all these other ones. Now, most people are very happy about ladybugs. There's something all warm and fuzzy about those. But all of these are good bugs in our garden because they help control pests. They're actually natural enemies or beneficial insects. Having them in your garden requires very little input because they're natural and the control they provide is free. It's part of their jobs. They are a sustainable solution to pest control. They really do help keep pests in check. They're already there and they do enhance biodiversity, not only of the insect population, but everything that they feed as well. So they feed on the pests, and yes, other organisms feed on them as well. They're not immune to being eaten by birds or lizards, etc. So these natural enemies include, you might recognize some of these, and hopefully with seeing these, you'll have a better appreciation for them in your own gardens. The aphid midge, that's this, I want to get my cursor back on this screen. These are the aphid midges. They almost look like mosquitoes, but they're not. And their larvae are particularly voracious in terms of eating aphids and other organisms. Damsel bugs, you'll see these clusters of eggs on the bottom sides of leaves. Damsel bugs also prey on a lot of different pests. And then the green lacewings as well. Ground beetles are very aggressive predators in terms of dealing with, they feed on slugs and other organisms that are they find on the ground. Our lady beetles. Now, one of the things to know about lady beetles is you'll see the larvae on your plants too, and they look like these what we call little alligators. They eat even more aphids than do adult lady beetles. So when you see those, leave them alone because they're doing their job. And then we've got the minute pirate bugs as well. Like I mentioned, the ground beetles, because oftentimes this is another thing that people see them, or they see their larvae and get grossed out and freak out and want to kill them. No, they take care of cutworms, cabbage maggots, mites, earwigs, all kinds of other pests. So you really want to encourage beetles in your garden, not get rid of them. Parasitic wasps. Oftentimes these almost look like flying ants. They're so small. Some of them are so small you barely even notice them. They're very particularly good at parasitizing or and sucking out aphids and leaving the mummies behind. Oftentimes these wasps are very specific, and there's a lot of variety in broconid wasps. So again, those do a huge job. And this is just an example of one parasitizing a tomato hornworm. They lay their eggs all over it, and those eggs eventually just, they're eating that tomato hornworm from the inside out. And then eventually that tomato hornworm is not able to continue feeding, but it may persist for a while until it dies. We've got soldier beetles and spiders, tachinid and hoverflies, all beneficial, all feed on other insects that are generally considered pests in the garden. So to attract these beneficial insects, we really want to maintain a continuous supply of flowers, and preferably native flowers, in our gardens, because they also oftentimes need a source of pollen and nectar early in their lives, or as a supplement to the insects that they're feeding on. So our pollinators include a much larger category of other insects than bees, or our wasps. There's huge, and bees and wasps are very closely related. Flies can be pollinators. We mostly know that butterflies are pollinators. A lot of people don't think of it that way. And then moths, and then sometimes ants, and then beetles sometimes too. This is an example. I'm going to go through these pretty quickly, but flesh flies, blowflies, soldier flies can be beneficial. Our butterflies and moths, them feeding on the flowers in terms of the nectar, disturbs the pollen and inadvertently pollinates. And then these are hummingbird moths, or also called clearwing moths, which are just a totally neat thing to find in the garden. In planting natives, and particularly coyote mint, I have bumblebee moths in my garden, which I'm always thrilled to see. A wide variety of beetles provide pollinator services. And then our common bees that we have here include honeybees, carpenter bees, leaf cutters, etc. Honeybees, though, are not native. They are a transplant, and they are essentially livestock. They have to be managed in hives and taken care of to keep the populations healthy. The colony collapse disorder is a big issue, and it really is a combination of factors. It's not any one particular thing that is affecting that, but you can see here what those factors are. With our native bees, we have over 1,600 species alone in California. Most are solitary and actually nest underground. Oftentimes you'll think that you're seeing an ant hole somewhere. There's this hole with, kind of crumbly material around the outlet of that hole. And it's more likely to be a native bee nest as opposed to ants. If you're not seeing the ants, it's a native bee nest. So 70% of our native bees nest underground, and the other 30% nest in cavities like stems of plants or post holes or any, they'll nest under this. I know that when we resided our house, we found just tons of bee nests because they'll get up under any crack they can to nest. Our bumblebees are very social and generalist, and there's something that I think for the most part, all of us have seen and know a bumblebee. But they're particularly critical for fertilizing tomatoes and eggplants and blueberries. So if you grow those particular plants, you want to be planting the kinds of plants nearby that attract those and that will help with those pollinator services. Carpenter bees, they resemble bumblebees. They're large and they nest in soft and decaying wood. And that can be good or bad, depending on if they're using your home, or generally in nature, they're out using decaying logs or, trees, stems, etc., whatever that is. Leaf cutter bees, those are really kind of cool. Oftentimes people are disturbed to see these circles cut out of their roses, but particularly you'll see this on red buds. And they cut these leaves out and roll that piece up and then stick it in a hole in their brood chambers. I think it's pretty cool now. Now that I recognize what they are, I'm like, oh yeah, I've got, cut leaf cutter bees. These longhorn bees, I frequently see pollinating and feeding on my native wildflowers. They have extra long antennae, and that's how you distinguish them from other types of bees. And they're ground nester. Orchard mason bees are really considered the super pollinator. They do a whole lot more work than even honeybees do. But they don't travel very far from their nests, and they're non-aggressive, and it's something that you want to encourage nearby in your yard if you particularly if you have a vegetable garden and orchard trees, anything like that. But they'll be there if you have native plants. Our sweat bees, those pretty little metallic looking green bees. And then hummingbirds are also pollinators. We usually don't think about them that way, but as they actually feed on the nectar of a plant, they inadvertently pollinate just like butterflies. So to support pollinators in the garden, they need three things. They need food, water, and shelter. And you need to consider in the food portions your plant selection, the plant diversity, and the arrangement of plants in the garden. Again, these bees have co-evolved to pollinate native plants, and the fewer native plants you have, the fewer native pollinators you will have. So including more native plants will increase that population of native pollinators. So one of the things I remember seeing this study at one of the pollinator seminars at UC Davis, and there's been a lot of studies done on the preferences of bees, and they've really done it. There's enough work to actually support that native pollinators are primarily attracted to native plants. When they have them side by side or in the same areas, they find that they really don't prefer those non-natives. So pollinators are looking for plants with lots of nectar and pollen, large masses of flowers. So that's the whole thing about the landscape, how you place your plants or the varieties. If the plants are small, say like yarrow, you want to do something that creates a patch of roughly 3 foot by 3 foot. That's close. 9 square feet is close enough to 10 to make a difference. They see it better rather than just having one here, one there, and one over there. In a lot of cases, one shrub will fill that, meet that standard. And then as much diversity as you could get in terms of flower shapes and sizes, and then the sequence. Really aim for having flowers, well, February, January, the manzanitas start blooming. All the way, I got plants blooming in my garden clear through the end of October. So there is very little downtime. The thing is, those other 2 months of the year, those bees are hibernating, or they have laid their eggs, they've died, but those eggs will not emerge as larvae and bees until January, February, when the nectar is available. So I've shown you kind of, this is the holes. This is what the ground nesting bee holes look like. And there's right here is a bumblebee going into a hole, or a similar, probably is a bumblebee. So knowing that bees, they require this kind of habitat, You want to not necessarily cover every square inch of your yard in mulch, but provide places like this for them to nest. Leave those patches. And as a food source, besides nectar and, for native bees, or excuse me, native birds, besides insects, oftentimes the native berries are another major part of the required food source for them to, especially for migrating birds. Studies have shown that the fat content of our native species is much higher than that of introduced species. And so that there's a natural preference for that. Again, there's some facts here that, they really are much, introduced plants can be far less than our native plants. So in building homegrown habitat, shrink the lawn and remove invasive species in particular. Invasive species are those that will just absolutely take off and become a problem, as opposed to the normal introduced plant. Invasive species continue to expand and displace native species, again, impacting populations of both insects and birds. You focus on planting keystone species to really power up your landscape, especially if you have a smaller yard. And I'll talk a little bit later about what keystone species are. Every locale has keystone species, and not just oak trees are one. They're our biggest powerhouse in terms of supporting wildlife in this state. And be generous with your plantings. And I will say that somewhat, you still need, we still have issues with needing to be fire resilient. So you don't want to be planting too densely, but densely enough. And for the health of the plants, you don't want them very dense. Really, when you look out in nature, it kind of looks like it can be dense out there, but if you generally walk around, and if you prune those back a little bit, you'll see that even native habitat isn't exceptionally dense in many cases, in most cases. So a keystone species, it's 14% of the plants provide 90% of an insect's food, and they really help support that food web. So I'll tell you later so we really want to focus on planting a wide variety or diversity of native plants. And then working and partnering with neighbors, if they're interested in doing the same thing, just allows you to have that much more positive impact. Installing water features or some kind, it can be small in terms of bird bath size, water features. This is my pond waterfall, and it is just, I love watching the birds come to this all summer long. Whoops. Okay. Bee hotels, if you don't have, obviously we don't want them necessarily nesting, or oftentimes the way our homes are built anymore, the siding is so tight and they can't get up under it. We may not have many nesting places available for those who like to nest in cavities. So you can provide these bee hotels, and it's very simple, and dispersing them around your yard is more beneficial than focusing on one big unit that actually becomes potentially a disaster, because when you have that many, the population, it's more difficult. Let's put it this way, they're more susceptible to disease and other pests like mites and that. So avoid doing something grandiose like this. Focus on doing very small solutions and putting them around your yard. Knowing what caterpillar pupation sites are and keeping those there is also very critical. Again, caterpillars are the primary food for baby birds, and the thing is that more than 90% of these caterpillars, some of them may hang on to plants, but a lot of them drop off and actually continue maturing under the leaves that drop off in the fall. So disturbing those leaves, and especially removing them, greatly impacts caterpillar populations. And then lawn is just pretty well useless for caterpillars, period, mainly because it's mown all the time. Getting back to the keystone species in California, in our region in El Dorado County, I have all 5 of these oaks on my property alone, and they're ubiquitous throughout the county. And the higher you go, California black oaks go to a higher elevation than do these others. Valley oaks and blue oaks pretty much persist in the lower elevations. Canyon live oaks somewhere in between, as well as the interior live oaks. Other keystone species include the native wild cherries, and those make a nice, you get flowers with those, and berries that attract the birds later too. So it's kind of got more bang for the buck. Willows, if you've got areas where you've got creeks or areas that stay wet somewhat, you don't have to, willows can persist, especially on ephemeral streams where, they're growing well and they get most of their water during the winter and spring, and then they can stand to have some drought during the summer. But if you've got any wet places, putting in a willow would be great. Other species include lupin and sagewort, the artemisia, coyote bush. Now, the artemisia and the baccharis, which is the coyote bush, you want to keep out at least 30 feet away from your home for fire resilience. Those are higher in the flammable material, they're not toxins, chemicals that can make them burn hotter. And then the senecio, goldenrod, rabbit bush. Rabbit bush you also want to keep further away from the home than deer vetch. Deer vetch is a delightful low-growing plant, native plant. Wild strawberries, those are if you're ever going to put plants near your home, these days, fire resiliency really calls for keeping a 5-foot zone away from your home where there's absolutely no organic material. However, a lot of people find that hard to tolerate. Wild strawberries, if you're going to plant something near the house, wild strawberries would be a great way to go. Or on a slope, they make a nice ground cover. So finding these plants, finding natives, because especially our big box stores are very limited, offer very limited selections of native plants. I would urge you, here in El Dorado County, we've got a great chapter, and this is the one for which I've been the horticulture chair for the past 2 years, and I organize our plant sales. And that's not why I talk about this. It's just, it's neither here nor there. It's because everybody around California has a hard time finding natives in pots to plant in their yards rather than going and digging one up somewhere or trying to propagate them from seed. So anyway, if you're not from El Dorado County, chances are you have a chapter in your area in California. So seek that out. And the majority of them do run plant sales of some type. But they also, besides that, you've got lots of resources on gardening with natives. So that's a great resource. This is a list that our chapter offers in terms of delineating plants that really work well in gardens. So this list, and this presentation will be made available later on YouTube. So if you are missing these lists and you can't get, can't write it down quick enough, this will be available later for you to kind of come back to and take a look at these lists. But this is on our chapter's website. There's another fabulous resource, Calscape, which is an extension of the California Native Plant Society. Here you can either go in and search by name or plug in the specific area you lived in and hit enter and go up to, once you plug in right here, whoops, let me go back. I don't think I can go back. Yeah, once you've plugged in your area, go up here and then click on advanced search. It will provide you with this list, and you can see that there's a lot of parameters that you can select from to find plants that suit your particular needs and garden. Down to color and watering, and if you want to, you want to shop at a particular nursery, the flowering season, etc. So this is just an example, excuse me, an example of selecting for some of those parameters. Now, in this case, I wanted to find shrubs that would grow and cool in full sun with using extremely low water. So it gave me two options. And those are actually both two very good options, although it's not a lot of selection. Going back and selecting for part shade and moderate to high water. Now I'm really looking for moderate water, something, for instance, that can grow hand in hand with my orchard trees, my fruit trees, which I've trained to be more like shrub trees. You can see I get a lot more selection that pops up. So then you can click on each one of these options and it will tell you a lot more about it. It'll show you pictures of the plants. It'll show you a map of where it's native. Then when you scroll down even further, it tells you about the sizes, the dormancy, flower color, when it blooms. And it also shows you in detail the wildlife it supports, in particular the insects. And one of the things I've discovered is that almost every plant supports moths. Almost every native plant out there supports moths in one form or another. Maybe not a lot, and some of them support a lot more insects than others. But it also goes into a lot more detail, sort of like you would find in a Sunset Western Garden book. And even a lot of them have the sunset zones delineated. This particular page, Calscape, is going to be undergoing a major revamp to even improve it more for gardening use. So other things besides plant material, other things you want to be looking at to support the good bugs in your yard is again, replace lawn, especially under trees, with native shrubs and ground covers. Lawn under trees, it just stresses out trees that much more because lawn is robbing the water and the nutrients and competing. Native plants and native shrubs, native plant material has a much less requirement for nutrients. They're just adapted to less. They get what they need in our soils naturally. Using large decorative boulders provides pupation sites and places for lizards to hide and that. And then if you can let logs or old tree stumps just lay well away from the house, at least 30 feet from the house. Again, the decaying wood provides habitat and hiding places. It's a great place for mycorrhizae to get going, and you'll find mushrooms growing on this stuff oftentimes. So beyond providing the habitat, how you manage your gardens, how you take care of them, and what you do really affects what's out there as well. Again, maintain as continuous a supply of flowers as possible. Provide those bare patches of soil for our ground nesting friends. Don't cover every inch. Leave some patches bare of mulch. Do not use particularly insecticides, and judiciously use herbicides when if it's absolutely necessary. You should really avoid tilling the soil. Now, when I constructed my yard, because it's terraced the way it is, yeah, I put in lots of amendments into that and tilled deeply to get things mixed and be able to move the soil. That was a one-time thing. And now I've got all kinds of organisms back in there. And leave the leaves in the fall when possible. Our leaves generally don't start falling until after fire season is done. And you want to keep 5 feet clear from your home. That's fine. So remove the leaves from immediately around any structures, including decks. But other than that, I take and rake almost all of my leaves under my large oaks, because I really want to protect them from the soil drying out as much as possible. But I also want those nesting habitats for the butterflies and moths. So you can see how small, you don't even notice some of these eggs. They're so minute that it's hard to kind of fathom. It's not something that's necessarily right in your face that, oh, there's an egg there. So using natural leaf litter whenever possible, and let it be, is great. If not, if you have a place where you can actually take it and in a wheelbarrow and just leave it deposited somewhere else, that's the next best solution, as opposed to grinding them up or burning them. All these little insects right here and organisms, the salamander and the frogs and our bees, the little snakes, the little tiny snakes, are all made possible by leaving those leaves there. Can't stress enough, don't spray or fertilize. Again, all of those chemicals really impact the welfare of the insects, and especially our beneficial insects. One of the things to know about fertilizing is it's not only bad for the soil and the organisms, but what it does is it sweetens the plant material for pests, including deer. Plants that are fertilized are just more, new growth is more tender and more accessible for sucking in and chewing insects. So that's another reason to really avoid the fertilizers. And the thing is, our native plants really they're adapted to low nitrogen soils. They really do not need it. They feed themselves back in as they drop their leaves, and those decay and organisms incorporate those into the soil. That's all they need. And that's another reason not to remove the leaves, is because those leaves breaking down are their food source. So just said that our native plants are adapted. Avoid the use of security lights that are on all the time. Fit them with motion sensors if possible. Those blazing security lights, we've all seen how, moths, you put your porch light on for a little bit and all of a sudden you've got just a whole lot of moths hanging on the side of the house or buzzing around the lights. That ends up shortening their lives, if not making them really prone to getting picked off by bats or whatever. If you're going to mow, and oftentimes we may not have a lawn, I have pasture grasses, and pasture grasses may not be the right, because I don't have animals that feed on them, but I do need for fire safety on my property, I do need to mow. And so keep your mower deck as high as possible. I also have been successful I noticed that when I first moved back to our property in 2007, I had a small patch of yarrow, and it was probably all of 1 or 2 feet wide. And it's now 20 feet by 10 feet. And I don't mow that. And there's hardly any grasses. I go through and I pull out the grasses out in between there. so that it's not a fire danger, but it's this huge habitat patch that attracts the beneficial and feeds them. Many of you possibly may live in HOAs that restrict some of the things you do with gardening. And so lobbying and educating these organizations and anywhere you live, schools, even working on schools and your parks districts to include native plants so that we can expand habitat is a way to help. Our antiquated and destructive landscape regulations are oftentimes, it's becoming actually, the state of California recently enacted legislation prohibiting HOAs from limiting the use of native plants, which is a really good thing. So you decide, are you a baler or a dumper? Often a lot of us are trying to repair the ecosystems and trying to keep us afloat. But to the extent that you use non-native plants, introduced plants, and that it's adding the water back into that boat that we're trying to save. So you kind of want to think about it. If thinking about it that way helps you change the way you see things, then great, that would be great. And so again, I urge you to read Nature's Best Hope. It was for me opening up my eyes to a whole different way of landscaping. And as somebody who's been in the landscape business for over 40 years and has focused on non-native plants most of that time, this is absolutely eye-opening. So with that, we're going to open it up. And should you want to ask questions in that, this is where you can contact the Master Gardener's office or email with questions. But we will open it up now for questions.
Okay, thank you, Kit. There's been a few questions, but Tracy has kind of answered most of them. One was, if you have aphids infestation, what's your opinion on buying beneficial insects like ladybugs or lacewings to add to your garden?
That's usually, they'll fly away almost immediately once you get them home. They really are not beneficial. You're not going to usually get what you paid for, just simply because they're going to take off. It's better to provide the habitat to have them there. I mentioned how I have pasture grasses. I've got pasture outside of my fenced yard. And one of the things I noticed when I started mowing, I took on the mowing job when we moved back to this property, and I noticed all the lady beetle larvae in the grasses. It's one of the places, this is where they pupate. And I stopped mowing until later. A lot of people, some of my neighbors just keep everything mowed down to like 1 inch high. And so they don't get that benefit of actually raising ladybugs. So if you might want to look at, depending on where you live and what your landscape is, having that. But for the most part, purchased beneficials will just take off. And I've heard this time and time again from people that it's like, well, I let them go and never saw them eating anything on my plants. So there's that.
Yeah, Tracy said the best strategy is to knock the aphids off with a strong stream of water. And then she included the UCIPM pest notes on that. Right.
That can be very effective. Just know you might also be washing off the eggs of beneficials as well. So, I've gotten to a point where the one plant I noticed that has a lot of aphids on it every year is the milkweed. It has, actually, what was interesting, first year it had all of those aphids. Second year, very few of them did until later in the year when the plants are more stressed. That's when they're more prone to that. But so just kind of work with it and observe. whether or not it's necessary to, so I don't even bother with the milkweed, washing them off the milkweed anymore. And I have since also seen, and I've got photos of the lady beetles starting to move in on them.
Then there's another question that Tracy answered about a list of native plants and where to purchase them. And she mentioned, our plant sale we have in April. And then Stacy also wanted to know if there's a name and number of someone we could come out and advise us. But as master gardeners, we only provide education.
Yeah, if you will contact me through CNPS, we will do some of that. So you can contact me directly.
And then
I'll type my my email address in the chat.
And also she has a huge issue with moles, voles, and gophers.
Oh, yeah. And there's my email address. Okay. So moles are actually somewhat beneficial to the garden. They don't do damage. They keep the soil worked up. They actually help move beneficial organisms through the soil. Gophers, I'm using those electronic solar powered devices in various parts of my yard. Plus I have 2 Jack Russell Terriers. So, they, between those 2, but I have noticed that the gophers do not come in to those areas where I have those devices. The moles just go right around them. So they say they affect moles too. I've not found that, but like I said, I'm not concerned about the moles. They don't do damage. The voles and are little tiny mice-like creatures. That has a lot to do with food sources and that. Again, that one, I would urge you to look at the pest notes, the UC pest notes. I've not had that problem myself with those. I have found them in the yard, but they've not done any direct damage to my trees, or my plants. What was the other organ? Moles, voles, gophers?
Yeah, just those 3.
That was it. Okay.
And then what about leaves in the springtime? I have tons of leaves, pine and oak. And what are your thoughts on mulch and wood chips?
Okay, so yes, so mulch in general is generally beneficial for most plants, including native plants. Usually advise 2 to 3 inches at the maximum. Absolutely no organic mulch within 5 feet of your home or deck structures. For fire reasons, use rock mulches in those areas. But otherwise, yeah, it helps keep the soil cooler, keeps weeds down, holds more. So, and then it feeds back as it breaks down. It helps feed the soil. So no, that's very good. Really watch pine needles. Pine needle mulch can be just fine, but it's very flammable compared to what you want to be looking at is what's called composted wood chips, not giant wood chips. I also teach the some of the fire resilient safety classes. And so I'm very hesitant to advise using the big, you don't want to use big wood chips. You want to get as small as possible, just because of the fire danger issues. But no, using wood chips is great. Pine needles, keep them well away from the house, again, because of flammability. And the pine needles are not the same kind of, don't have that habitat value that broadleaf tree leaves have. I know I still have some, I see some of the leaves out in the garden that haven't totally decayed yet, but through the early part of the summer, again, keeping them well away from the house is good. So.
And here's one from Crystal. I live in Rescue, California. This last year I had a lot of small black beetles in my garden that were all over my beans and peas. They came out of the wood pieces from my bed frames. Do you know what they are? They are shiny and about 5 to 8 millimeters long.
Well, I see that Tracy answered the question with the box elder beetles, that they don't cause significant damage to the landscape plants, which is a good thing. So there's good. Thanks, Tracy, for providing that. I've not had much experience with those, but again, if they are pests, keep making sure that you have as many beneficial insects as possible helps manage those that are pests. So
Now here's one from Monty. I live in Cool. Is there a recommended percentage of amendment mixed into the native soil?
So my question there is so if you're planting native plants, you really don't need to amend your soil. You might want to break it. I mean, obviously you have to dig a hole to plant a plant, and digging it bigger, at least twice as large as that pot, will help break that up and allow you to get that plant for the roots to start expanding out more quickly than if it's, if you dig the hole just the size of the pot itself, it's going to take that plant longer to get those roots out further away. If you are amending for vegetable gardens or introduced plants, adding an inch or two of compost into the soil is generally beneficial to the plants. So 1 or 2 inches of compost.
That is all the questions that are in the chat room.
Okay.
So is there anything else you'd like to comment about, Kit?
Nope, I think I got most of it out.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you everyone for attending our class today.